many innocent lives did you consume?
I don't know. How many loaves of bread have you eaten in your lifetime?
Proof positive that true evil doesn't need logic. I mean, that at least seemed to be the mindset that Hirohiko Ariaki went in when creating the iconic JoJo villain. As according to an interview for a Japanese literary magazine, Kotoba, he said evil is compelling when it feels unknowable. It should be something that you can't fully wrap your head around and therefore make it difficult to predict what they'll do next. In his view, it was like how adventure stories revolve around mysteries beyond the comprehension of people in regular society, making villains obstacles we have to overcome like a good mystery.
We
already did the Raincoat video. The point is that Araki enjoyed writing for Dio, as he basically found creating such a pure villain a fascinating experience that he even researched actual serial killers for. And judging by, again, how freaking iconic Dio Brando is to this very day, yeah, I'd say he succeeded. Because really, who doesn't enjoy a complete monster of a villain? I mean, don't get me wrong, I also enjoy tragic baddies who sway between the alignments, or at least have a little bit more of a relatable edge to them. However, depending on the show, they can be more of the side dishes like the lower tier villains, while the actual main baddies should be like your Darkseids or Green Goblins or Jokers.
No, what the heck, I'll laugh anyway.
Not that one. I mean, yeah, we just used a couple of comic book examples and then there's the thumbnail and everything. But no, we're talking about the Precure one. Yeah, for this video, we wanted to analyze why we think Joker, the Dragon Emperor Piero, and a clown on a 1001 different watch list is by far the greatest pure villain of the Precure franchise. We'll look at his role, accomplishments, and attempt to make some sense of his actions, and why guys like him and other great villains truly made their corresponding protagonists that much better. So get your bear mace ready, and be sure not to follow any stray balloons as we take a look at the legend that is Smile Precure's Joker. Joker was introduced in the 6th episode of the season, right after the team had been fully formed, and the 3 other generals had been introduced. Interestingly, in the case of the latter, and while they could be destructive at times, the 3 initial bad-end generals were more like comedic relief baddies. Just some hammy villains who would constantly try to flex on one another, and even unintentionally at times play along with the antics of the show's main heroines. This made sense, as Smile Precure was meant to be a bit more of a laid-back series after a truly tragic event in Japan's history. About 1 year before the first episode of this show aired, a massive earthquake had hit Japan, resulting in tsunamis and the nuclear power plants in Fukushima to melt down. The latter in particular had left the country with some rather frightening after effects. In response, all toy productions, including Precure, tried to give their shows some more hopeful, positive spins. And for the most part, I'd say they succeeded. I mean, sure, Sweet Precure was somewhat hampered by having several of their plot lines be needlessly rewritten and rushed, but shows like Gokaiger turned out even better than originally planned, as many old Sentai actors did return to uplift the country through rather touching little cameos, and I would say the more comedy-driven 2012 shows Kamen Rider Forze and Smile Precure turned out great. We bring this all up just to highlight how Joker's arrival into the show was just a bit of a shock to the system. At first, he did seem like just another goofy villain, just being some random Harlequin who strolled in, but then... Police! Help! Help! And while he would make kinda sporadic appearances from then on, with his next appearance being another 6 episodes later, each time he did, he would provide some sort of intel or new power-up for the baddies. Most notably, in the case of the latter, he was responsible for creating all of the Akambe variants. And they were all significant upgrades or adjustments for the monsters of the week, like the blue noses that were physically weaker but resistant to the Precure's individual finishers, or more powerful variants that were created with stuff like 2 MacGuffins instead of just 1, or used his fellow generals as conduits that put stress on their bodies. Though, in the case of the latter, that was a price he was willing to let them pay.
Some of you may die, but it's a sacrifice
I am willing to make.
Yeah, while probably not immediately apparent to his fellow generals, this guy was ruthless and took whatever steps he deemed necessary to revive their lord and master Piero. That plus his ingenuity always gave him a sense that he was scheming something, or at the very least had a plan B on standby in case the Precure were getting too close to defeating them. To sum it up, he is what is referred to as a Knight of Service. Basically, they're the antagonists designed to shake up the status quo by upping the danger levels. They're often contrasted with more comedic villains who of course pose a much lesser threat compared to them at least. And from there, if the writers played their cards right, these characters could lead to some drastic and yet not unearned tonal shifts in the overall story, especially if their big debut was properly foreshadowed. Joker certainly accomplished the foreshadowing with that introduction, as well as some clear scheming behind the scenes. And yet, once he did properly introduce himself to the Precure, well...
Hey kids, wanna see a dead body?
So glad that we're doing this video so close to Halloween, considering that anyone who actually watches this probably won't want to go trick-or-treating afterwards. While it might have taken him a little while to actually confront the superheroines, the clown did not fool around and made the most out of his introduction to the girls. As on top of unleashing a legit surprising sneak attack, stealing almost all of their decors, and kidnapping Candy, he later gave the Precure one of the most passively aggressive, yet somehow still savage riffs ever that managed to blue scream all of them at once. And he would pretty much repeat this pattern each time he directly confronted the Precure by either forcibly turning them into dead-eyed lazy bums or making them literally fight their dark sides. On a bit of a side note, the Bat and Precure were easily his greatest creation and deserve more than about an episode's worth of screen time. I mean, sure, like a lot of things in the show, you could say they're ripping off Yes 5, including having one of them sound very familiar.
あなたたちが勝つことはないのよ。絶対になんて見苦しい。そんな無様な姿にビューティーを名乗る資格はない。
But come on, those are just great designs. I digress though, and while there is one more accomplishment that we could bring up in this next section, I think we'll save that for later, as even then, Joker, especially for a Precure villain, has one of the most impressive win-loss records. Sure, you could argue that they were undone each time, but the fact still didn't change that he got that initial W, which was hammered home each time the episode allowed him to hold it for at least a week. In the case of the aforementioned introduction to the Precure, he technically held it for 2 weeks. And in fact, until his death near the end of the series, he was always the villain who left the episode on a pretty shocking cliffhanger. Now, believe it or not, there is actually a great significance to how many cliffhangers a Precure season is afforded, especially nowadays, unfortunately. I'll admit, I am getting this second-handedly, so it could just be a rumor, but it also is kind of evident when you actually look at the episode guides for the more recent seasons. That being how Toei seems to have set a limit on how many cliffhangers a Precure season is afforded, under the impression that ending episodes with them will leave the target audience scared and therefore unwilling to buy their toys. Not realizing that one of the main reasons they're not selling as well these days is probably due to those damn prices. I mean, jeez, in this economy? But yeah, in conjunction with the decreased violence following Gold Princess's underperformance, Toei seems to have made it so that even if the Precure find themselves in especially heralding situations, the conflict has to be resolved by the end of the episode, otherwise they'll be afforded less cliffhangers that the writers would want to save up for the endgame of the series. Now, aside from the fact that it should be a given that the final act of any show will have some of the most dramatic moments, and therefore should be automatically afforded as many cliffhangers as needed, the fact that Toei seems to be enforcing such an arbitrary rule in the first place is just ridiculous. We actually brought it up recently in the Hirogaru Sky reviews near the beginning of that series, when we were surprised that they had done a cliffhanger that early into the series, when it ended with Kabuto terrorizing the city. We were hoping that it was at least a sign that they were laying up on that stupid rule, though judging by the fact that Spearhead, the guy who's supposed to be the most threatening of the Undargu Empire, so far hasn't gotten any significant W's or cliffhangers, might be a sign that they just blew their load early on or something. The point is that those 1 or 2 weeks of letting the villains hold their W's are important. as by doing so, it allows the tension to increase over time and make the inevitable victory for the heroes all the more rewarding. And sure, you could say it's meant to entice the viewers to come back the following week, which has always been a thing with serialized programming ever since the days of the radio, but that doesn't change the fact that it often does make the story more interesting and could even lead to better toy sales, as even objectively proven with Smile Precure. We'll get a little more into that later, but first, let's try and make some sense of this clown. Considering we've already kind of hinted at his brother from another mother, let's compare this Joker with the one from DC Comics. Now, of course, like many comic book characters, depending on the continuity, the interpretation of the Clown Prince of Crime can vary. He could turn out to be just some guy who got his skin bleached, something supernatural, or an angsty teen. God, I hate modern comics. Still, the most commonly accepted portrayal is as just a walking embodiment of anarchy. Meanwhile, you could say the Precure one is the embodiment of despair, and yeah, they are kind of similar in the sense that they both seek some form of discord, though they're still ultimately different goals. That said, their preferred methods of achieving their respective goals were pretty much the same, in that they both wanted the respective heroes of their stories to fully experience what they were selling. Because for them, those would be the ultimate poetic victories, having walking symbols of hope completely bend to their nihilistic views. Have them realize that all of the positive ideals they were working towards were ultimately meaningless. And to their credit, their views were shown to be far from wrong. In the case of DC, even if the clown didn't exist, Gotham City would always be a corrupt hellhole where the Wayne family could never have a happy life together, even in different dimensions. And while the Sunday morning world of Precure was almost overly pure, each of the Cures would inevitably have to face the fact that they had their own hardships to overcome, be it low self-esteem, family troubles, or even understanding what they truly wanted out of life. Both of these clowns would constantly try to make their heroes question why they even bothered to maintain their ideals. For a couple of pranksters like them, those would be the greatest punchlines possible. When you get down to it, Precure's Joker is not that deep of a character. I mean, I think even the DC one could be sympathetic, depending on which story of his you actually believe. And yet, at least when it came to the Precure, he did have a set goal that, at times, even took priority over serving what he did view as essentially his god. Thus, it came down to our protagonist to decide on how to deal with him. When you get down to it, the ultimate reason any sort of antagonist is introduced into a story is so that the protagonists have something they need to defeat, and in turn, get the viewers to want to see that. Again, while Smile Precure had the original 3 bad end generals, who, likely by design, people grew to like, and even wanted to see them earn their happy endings, which they did, they were also likely the tonal counter to Joker and his very punchable face. Yeah, don't get me wrong, I know this whole video just sounds like me fanboying for this clown, which I kind of am because he is important to the narrative of Smile Precure, but at the same time, let's all admit, we really wouldn't want to meet this guy in a dark alley. Joker just has all the traits that make you want to see him be put down permanently. From the way he tortures and gets way too close to some of these young girls, to how he outright gaslights and convinces his cohorts to go out on Sudoku missions, he's a prime example of a villain you love to hate. Others like him would be guys like Dio, who, yeah, while he can be very charismatic, he was also a chauvinist, an indirect child, redacted, and in fact the less said about him and dogs the better. And of course, going back to those ES5 comparisons, Kaori no, the also creepy skinny dude, who also lit enough gas to fuel a rocket. However, as we went over, this clown wasn't immediately taken down, and he did get several legit victories over the Smile team, which on paper you would think would make them look like one of the weaker teams, but quite the opposite. After their initial loss to Joker in the first half of episode 22, the Smile team took the remaining half of that episode to reflect on their next course of action. Mainly, whether or not they should even continue the fight after both such a physical and verbal beatdown that even led to them breaking their very creed as the team of superheroines meant to protect everyone's smiles when they couldn't even protect their own. Of course, in the end, they of course chose to continue the fight, but again, it took them like half an episode to find their resolves, and even going into the next episode, they need to further psych themselves up to the point that they could defeat all of the generals and an extra powerful Kanbei individually. These girls just went through a lot, basically 2 episodes worth of losses, to achieve one of the biggest and most satisfying victories in this franchise, all because Joker basically told them GG all. And sure enough, they did just that, even acquiring their mid-season power-ups in the form of the Princess Candles. This pattern would repeat every time Joker either directly encountered them, or sent out the other generals with semi-final ultimatums, with the Precure either getting a new toy or unlocking their Ultra Instincts as a result. Yeah, kind of ironically, one of the best power-ups the Precure could have ever asked for weren't their overpriced pieces of plastic, but rather one of their worst enemies. Seriously, if they're going to sell at those prices, I hope they at least improve the QC on these things. But yeah, to me, this was what truly pushed Joker into the top tier of not just my Precure villains list, but anime supervillains in general. He forced his protagonists to get better by being a constant threat to them. And that to me is what many modern baddies are kind of lacking. I mean, even from the standpoint that you want to sell a new toy, isn't it better to actually see the Precure struggle to gain their new power-up? I mean, sure, sometimes they would face a slightly stronger monster of the week, but I really can't think of anyone who was presented as such a consistently dangerous threat as this puppet master. As even after his first actual defeat in the show, we all kind of knew that he was just gonna come back worse than ever. Hell, even after his terrifying death, it felt almost too good to be true, and you'd be kind of right about that. In 2016, a sequel epilogue novel to Smile Precure was written supposedly by Yuji Kobayashi, and yet the foreword hinted that the true author was none other than Joker, having been revived by the last of Pierrot's powers and trapping the Precure in his little story where he had total control, even being able to show them the table of contents at one point. Yeah, I always knew that the ultimate form of despair and misery was just another Deadpool clone. But yeah, I guess Decade Precure actually predicted this book since it came out 3 years prior. Well, either that or Toei told to plagiarize them, which would you all be surprised. Anyway, while I haven't had the time to read all of it just yet, I know that the basic premise of this novel is that Joker tried to make the Smile team fall into despair again by ultimate precuring them, even though it's only been about a year after their show ended, to give them a preview about the horrors of adulthood. A very solid plan, mind you, but of course, ultimately, they overcame it and defeated him, though not before giving the guy his flowers. Yep, in his final moments, Yuki thanked the clown for giving them the greatest happy end possible by sinking them into despair so that they could rise up stronger both as individuals and as friends. And as you'd imagine, his reaction was something like, how appropriate for the character dressed like a fool to be the receiver of the final and most ironic of punchlines in this entire series. 'Tis nothing more than a comedy of errors for this poor Harlequin, and yet it still rightfully led to the greatest Precure villain ever. You provided the best scares and best laughs, gave the Precure the greatest defeats and victories, and we clap for you, Joker, both because we admire your accomplishments and know that you hate it in this context.
That's not funny.
Thank you for watching another, and hopefully not the last Halloween video we'll do for this year. Yeah, sorry, this might have taken a little longer than we had originally expected, but there is still time to get at least one more video out before the 31st, so after taking a look at unquestionably the greatest Precure villain ever, why don't we take a look at an underappreciated villain faction? Won't spoil who it is just yet, but it'll probably be someone you're not exactly expecting. And until then though, farewell for now my friends, and wait, when is this video actually gonna come out on? Oh. Why, hello there, Mr. Dark Kitty. I think I'm just gonna go diagonally this way.